Okay, I'm hopeful that this video does not break your brain, okay? Now just stick with me. I've been reading a couple of books about David, and I've been looking at this through the lens of history. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, if something's in the Bible, it must therefore be historical. And yeah, maybe, sort of. At least in the books that I'm looking at with regard to King David, they're very comfortable saying that the Bible presents some over-aggrandized treatments of King David. It might even border on propaganda at certain points, especially in this book here by Joel Baden. He's a Yale professor, super young one too. It's called The Historical David, The Real Life of an Invented Hero. So you can tell just from the subtitle where he's going. He's actually reading against the grain of the stories of David in Samuel and Kings, and he's attempting to unearth the historical kernel of these stories. Now I know right off the bat that's gonna make you kind of feel queasy and scared and you don't really know what to do, but it's okay. Deep breath in and exhale. But I wanted to talk to you about how scholars approach this sort of thing. And really there's three schools of thought with regard to the historicity of the Old Testament. There's some people, like in this book here, A Biblical History of Israel by Tremper Longman and Ian Provan and V. Phillips Long. And they basically present a case where everything that you find in the Bible can have a historical core to it. Now, this is interesting because we don't have a lot of archaeological evidence, and we also don't have a lot of extra biblical evidence, meaning texts outside of the Bible that affirm the things that were happening prior to the kingdom of David. There's not a whole lot there. Doesn't mean it didn't happen, it just means that we're reliant upon the Bible. And then you have some arguments that would say like, well, you shouldn't expect to find any sort of texts or archaeological evidence for, say, the Israelites as they are wandering around in the desert for 40 years or whatever. And that's sort of the onus is, well, we don't have proof that they didn't exist, and we don't have proof that they do exist, so we can trust the Bible. And that's sort of where these guys land. And then on the complete opposite side of the spectrum, side note, these guys are called maximalists because they believe in the maximal amount of historical content in the Old Testament. And then you got a guy like Philip Davies. Philip Davies would be in the minimalist camp. Can you guess what he says? It's all made up. He would say that the Bible is a fabrication that was put together during the Persian period in the 4th century or so, and later. So the stories of the patriarchs are completely fabricated, he would say. We don't have archaeological evidence because there is none, because they didn't really exist. And then you've got some folks that hunker down right in the middle. Guess what they're called? You got it. Maximalist minimalists, or minimalist maximalist. Basically, they take up position in the middle and they begin to look at the archaeological evidence and the extra biblical evidence. They begin to reconstruct the Bible based on their best interpretation of the biblical text, the archaeological evidence, the extra biblical evidence that we have, all these sorts of things that play into how we can reconstruct the Bible and discover what is historical and what is not historical. And I know what you're thinking. A lot of you don't want any of it to not be historical because that would be difficult for you in holding on to the Bible as an important text. And I just want to push back on that just a touch. Understand that in the ancient world, they didn't have the same sort of thoughts about history writing that we do today. First of all, I would say that all history writing has an agenda. All history writing of any time in any place, none of it is objective. It's all attempting to tell a story, and that's really no different from the Bible. The Bible has a story to tell, and at times it is attempting to get the audience there, perhaps in the way that it thinks about David's empire and Solomon's empire as these vast sort of kingdoms, so much so that the Queen of Sheba even comes to see Solomon and marvel at all of the riches that he has. There's really no archaeological evidence to support any of that, and this might be an example of the biblical authors presenting their king as the greatest king. Saul has killed his thousands and David has killed his tens of thousands. And we can compare that to other texts outside of the Bible that will talk about their kings in this very embellished sort of way to promote the ideology that their king is the best king. It happens with other gods as well. Their gods are the best gods. And sometimes we take our 21st century expectations of history writing and we put that back on the Old Testament, which really isn't fair, because this is an ancient collection of stories and laws and poetry and wisdom that has been collected into what we now have in the Old Testament. Now, I also think in addition to that, that we can look at some of the Bible and judge it to be historical at its core, even if some of the details might not be exactly as they're written. Because once we get to David and beyond, we do have some real hardcore, I guess you could say, facts on the ground that help to root the stories in their moment in history. It gets a little bit more dicey when you get behind that and you go towards the period of the judges or the patriarchs, that sort of stuff. But we do have some historical hooks that not only hold up in the Bible, but they hold up according to texts outside of ancient Israel in surrounding cultures that will attest to the presence of Israel, to the kingdom of Israel and Judah, to the kings that are there, to the wars that are fought, those sorts of things. I really believe that it's important for us to have a fair set of expectations as we read the Bible, that maybe we're not reading like the recording of a video camera, and that's okay, because these are the books that we have been given. These are the books that tell the story of, ultimately, of Jesus and salvation that is through him. And while we might wish for a different image, this is the image that we have, and it's a good one, and it's a fascinating one, and it is worth our time and our consideration. So there you go. Now we've got a lot of stuff about David and about different ways of approaching Old Testament history. The maximalists who think that everything happened pretty much exactly as it's written, more or less. You've got the minimalists that say none of it happened at all. These are all fabrications that were written way after the fact. And then you have people in the middle, the maximalist minimalists or the minimalist maximalists that say, well, let's take the best of both of these and bring them together to have a reasonable expectation and understanding of what the Bible is. I hope your brain hasn't exploded. Please know that I love you, and I'd love to talk with you about this stuff over a Zoom, coffee, or a socially distanced get-together. But for now, just revel in the beauty of the Bible that we have and seek to understand what is at its core.